of a mess. How far does the camera go?
Just your shoulders and head.
Oh. I don't know what I'm going to say.
When the Blitz happened in Coventry, where were you?
I was in the house, and the sirens went very early, at 7 o'clock, and so my mother and younger brother decided to go down the communal shelters.
That was John, was it?
Yes.
Where was the shelter?
It had been built underground in a field next to Edwick School. We used to use this field for playing in.
Is that what we called the wreck afterwards?
No, the wreck was at the back of there. The wreck was quite a big place.
Didn't the wreck go onto Foleshill Road?
Yes.
So, how do you mean at the back?
You could get to it further up Foleshill Road, and there was a large entrance to it where there were some very old houses with the mills on top. They had their own weaving.
The 3-storey houses?
Yeah.
Who were they doing the weaving for?
Well, they used to supply ribbons to shops in Coventry. They had an outlet in Coventry. This is many years before the war, when they used to do the weaving there.
They were called top shops, is that right?
Yes. And
did they sell them to cashiers? And then cashiers?
Yeah. And it was called Gamble's Building, and there were very old houses built round a stone yard with a pump in the middle. And you walked up the side of the big entrance it was to get into the recreation ground called the Rec, where it was more like 2 big fields, but there was a roundabout and swings and seesaws.
Yeah.
And,
so whereabouts then was the air raid shelter?
Well, just along Foleshill Road and Cross Road, it was all Edwick School was all behind there, and also the big entrance to Edwick School was up the side of this field, and there was another entrance in Cross Road. So the shelter was in this field at the side of Edwick School, really.
Yeah.
And there were some houses on the left, and the field hedges and fencing was on the right. And the entrance to the shelter was down, it was all specially built, and it was down concrete steps to go in the shelter. I myself never went in it.
Really? All that time?
So, and I was 15 at the time. And
So what year was this?
1939.
Right at the beginning of the war then?
Yeah. And I was working at the time at forgot.
In a field?
No, H.M. Hobson Aircraft and Motor Components. I was a typist.
And whereabouts was that?
That was in Holbrook Lane, which was about quarter of an hour, 20 minutes walk from her. Anyway, I decided I wouldn't go down with the shelter with my mother and younger brother. I said I'd wait for my older brother, who was just in the last stages of his apprenticeship at Alfred Herbert's.
That was Eddy.
And that was his name was Eddy, yes. And he was due to finish work at 7.
Where at Alfred?
Alfred Herbert's, and it was only across the
Yeah.
road from us. And my father and also worked there. Anyway, the sirens went. My mother and John, my younger brother, went off to the shelters, and a few minutes later Eddy came in, and the kettle was boiling in the kitchen. It was quite a large old Edwardian house, and it was a large kitchen, and the fire, in the black fireplace with the hobs, and there was a built-in copper in the corner for washing. Anyway, the kettle was hanging over the fire, ready for Eddy to have his wash, and the sirens went, and straight away we heard what we thought was anti-aircraft guns, and so we thought we'd better go under our stairs, which my father had emptied out and just left blankets and things in there as shelter. So we went under there, and then bombs started to explode, and for once in my life I wasn't a bit frightened. I think it was not being with other people, just my brother and myself, and we decided we were stuck there. We couldn't get down to the shelters anyway. So it wasn't all that long before a bomb landed quite close by, and the windows in the kitchen blew in, and the blackout curtains were hanging in shreds, and the kettle was still merrily boiling on a bright fire. And I said to my brother, "Oh, they might see the flames, might see the fire glowing." Having no experience of this sort of thing, I suggested that we pour the water from the kettle on the fire and put the kettle out and the fire out, which we did. Unfortunately, when it was all over next morning, we discovered there was no water to be had anywhere. All the mains were smashed. So we could have done with that kettle full of water.
But you're in trouble for that then, were you?
No, funnily enough, I don't think we were, but I was. But there was a lot more went on in the night, and there were bombs all that seemed to be all the length of the main Foleshill Road, and a row of 4 houses next door, but one to us. Our house was a semi-detached with the clubhouse next door, and then there was a drive into the club and a row of houses, and we heard these bombs quite close by, and anyway, a bit later on it went very quiet, so my brother and I ventured out, and first thing we saw was that 4 houses had been completely demolished with bricks all over the path and the road, and we went in the opposite direction. My grandma lived in the same road as us, the other side of the road, and we discovered her house was in ruins as well. And it wasn't until next morning, when we didn't know where our 90-year-old grandma was, when we discovered that the wardens had carried her down the shelter. And then at 9 o'clock that morning, we saw her walking on her own across the school playground back to her ruined home, and that was heartbreaking. But my mother and my father had been far watching, and so hadn't met up with them. My mother and John, my younger brother, until next morning. We all gathered in the house, and what was left of it, the top of it had gone, the roof and the windows, and the front door was halfway up the stairs, and so there was, we knew we couldn't stay there, and but we decided first of all we'd have to get somewhere for my grandma to go. And we tried houses of her 2 other daughters who lived quite close by, but they'd also been partly destroyed. And then a daughter from Bulkington came and took my grandma and my uncle to stay with them in Bulkington. And our neighbours at the club and us that evening walked all the way to Alderman's Green to a school out there where they'd got a brick-built shelter. And we thought, oh, we'd be safer out there in the field. But as we were walking across the fields to get to the shelter, there were craters all the way. So anyway, we went into this shelter, and it was on above ground shelter, just brick building with no windows at all, and it was water running down the walls, dreadful state. But nothing much happened that night, so next morning we walked all the way back home, and I've overrun my story a bit, but my boss and the second in command came during that morning to see if I was still alive, and not being at work, and they said they'd do everything they could to help us. But I did go back to work the next day, and anyway, we managed to fit up living accommodation in the house, and we boarded up the windows, and we had the lounge at the front of the house, and it was a large dining room and then the kitchen, so they were all more or less bedrooms and living rooms. And so that's how we were for quite a long time.
So there's no roof on?
No, but they came, and of course the house belonged to the club next door. And so they saw with all, about all the building work that had to be done.
Did they cover it temporarily with tarpaulin
Yeah.
or something?
Yeah. Yes, and the best they could, and it's a shame really, because the front door that was smashed to bits halfway up and landed halfway up the stairs. It was beautiful. He made it. It was all coloured glass. It was a big bird, and it was really nice. So we ended up with just ordinary frosted glass in it.
What, they rebuilt the same door?
Yeah,
Repaired it?
no, I think, I'm not sure whether they rebuilt the same door, but I know it was frosted glass, no fancy bird on it.
Oh.
But so that was the beginning of the war for us.
Is that November? Is it?
November the 14th. And it started about 7 at night, and I think the sirens, the all clear, went about 7 the next morning.
So you went out during the night, didn't you?
Yeah, when we saw the houses next door, and we had to rush back because we heard the distinctive, very distinctive noise from the engines of the German planes, and we heard one coming over again, and we rushed back under the stairs, and quite a lot of bombs went off then. And then we went out again later on, and we met a gentleman that lived a few streets away, but he was the secretary of the club, and he come to have a look at it and see what damage. And he didn't stay long there because the sirens went yet again. So we heard a plane coming over again, so we went back to shelter. So that was the first night of it.
Goodness.
There was another blitz in April. I think it was about April the 9th, but that's never mentioned. And yet we were damaged again. No, they don't say much about the April blitz. But my father's brother was killed in a social club he was the steward of in Foleshill, further up Foleshill Road in Little Heath. He and his wife and some members were sheltering underneath the billiard table when it was completely demolished and he was killed. And my grandfather, my father's father, had died the day before, and he was in his coffin in his house in Foleshill Road when that was blitzed. And both of them are buried in the communal grave in the cemetery in Coventry.
What, London Road?
Yeah. So yes, so was amazing, the damage that was done, really.
Thanks, Mum.